Hi there. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, where it has been a historic day after the Supreme Court issued several blockbuster decisions, including a major victory for President Trump's efforts to expand his executive authority, but also delivering a setback to his party's efforts to overhaul how votes are counted heading into the midterms. Starting first with the big win for the administration. While the court rejected the president's attempts to fire Federal Reserve Board member Lisa Cook, it vastly expanded his power to oust leaders at other independent government agencies, ruling he could fire Rebecca Slaughter, an appointee to the Federal Trade Commission. Chief Justice John Roberts writing the majority opinion in the case, saying subordinates who exercise the president's power are subject to removal by him. Then and only then can they remain accountable to the president and the president to the people. But in a scathing and lengthy dissent, Justice Sotomayor, writing the court's ruling, quote, promises to unleash only chaos. Moments ago, President Trump was asked about the ruling and if he planned to fire other agency officials as a result.
The Supreme Court just affirmed your right to fire the heads of independent agencies. Should we expect more firings as a result of this ruling?
I don't think so. It gives me the right, and not me, it gives a president the right to do what the president should have the right to do. And it's very interesting. It's a big ruling. It's been going on for almost 100 years. They've been working on this, and you know that it comes down at my term is a very great honor. But it bestows additional powers, or maybe the same power on the president. The president has the right to do this, and that has to do with a lot of agencies all throughout the system.
And Rebecca Slaughter herself responding to today's decision and warning of its long-term implications.
And I think why it really matters is exactly as President Trump said, it is unprecedented, and it hands a massive amount of power away from Congress and to the president to shape economic decision-making in a way that will reward the rich and powerful and at the expense of ordinary Americans.
The Supreme Court also issuing a major decision on mail-in voting, rebuffing the president and ruling against the Republican National Committee that states can count mail-in ballots received after Election Day and rejecting a Republican challenge to Mississippi's law for late-arriving ballots. Justice Amy Coney Barrett writing the majority opinion in Watson v. RNC that, quote, while federal law dictates when ballots must be cast, state law dictates when they must be received. Moments ago in the Oval Office, President Trump reacting to that ruling as well, calling it surprising and, quote, very detrimental to honest elections. This despite there being no evidence that mail-in voting leads to widespread fraud. He also once again touted the need for his elections overhaul bill, the Save America Act, while suggesting he may not sign any bills, including a bipartisan housing bill, until the SAVE Act is passed. Joining me now are NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, NBC News senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett, NBC News senior Supreme Court reporter Lawrence Hurley, NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapur, and Nate Persily, a professor at Stanford Elections Law, and he is an elections law expert and a former research director for the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. Thank you guys all for being here. This is obviously a very important day. Let's start with Monica. Monica, does the White House see today as a good day or a bad day for the administration? Because this was kind of a mixed bag in the way these many decisions were handed down.
Exactly, Ryan. And that is what the president sort of took away from this. He likes to see in this the good for him, and that is likely what he will be touting, while also speaking out about the decisions that he disagreed with pretty severely. But specifically, the president is trying to take a victory lap on that case that you mentioned, the Slaughter case in particular. The president saying basically that this was something that he is very proud to have been the sitting president to oversee this kind of decision, because it would give him the authority to potentially remove people from these key independent agencies. And so the president is saying essentially that he feels that really gives him now the potential to do that, which he is saying is, again, an honor for him and something that he could do while on a case, for instance, that had to deal with Lisa Cook, who, of course, is the governor on the Federal Reserve, that he cannot remove her. He cannot fire her in the way that he tried to and attempted to, is saying essentially that maybe he will still pursue that through some potential other or different paths. So it is a mixed bag, like you said, with a couple of these different cases, and we can talk about the mail-in voting in a moment. But the president here trying to capitalize on what he sees could be potentially useful to him throughout the rest of his term. Ryan.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the Slaughter case first. This decision grants the president broader authority to fire officials at federal agencies. Has the White House indicated if it plans to use that authority? We heard the president kind of reject that notion initially, but this does give him a power that is now realized that he thought he had and now codifies. Could we see more firings?
We could, and at dozens of different agencies. So we're talking about the Federal Trade Commission in the case of Rebecca Slaughter, but this could apply to everything from the Postal Service to the SEC to the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Those are all these independent watchdogs, essentially, of these large corporations that oversee these things, in which now the president is saying he could use this case to remove people from there if he wanted to. He was asked pretty directly today and said that not necessarily, that it's not something immediately that we should expect to see more firings, but certainly if he wanted to and he made the decision and he could go forward with that, he would be able to do that, Ryan. All
right, you mentioned the mail-in voting case. The Supreme Court also rejecting the RNC's bid to throw out mail-in ballots that were received after Election Day. What is the Trump administration's reaction, especially as the president continues to demand Congress pass the Save America Act?
And this would be, as a reminder, a sweeping overhaul to the way that elections are conducted in the United States. Remember that a certain version of it has passed the House a couple of times, but there is not currently appetite in the Senate to pass that, even though what the president wants to see happen and what he has talked about repeatedly over the last many weeks and months is adding things to the Save America Act that's not even currently in what has been passed on Capitol Hill, as you know well. So the desire to actually change this doesn't seem to be there from the lawmakers, but from the president's perspective, from the White House, he is essentially saying that he might continue to hold other critical legislation hostage if there isn't action on the Save America Act. And in particular, he was asked about a housing bill that has passed both the House and Senate, and whether he would sign it or not. He said it hasn't been transmitted to him yet, but that even if it was, he'd have to take a look at it, because anything in comparison, he says, to the Save America Act is a, quote, big yawn. Here's a little more of what the president had to say when he was asked about this moments ago.
Well, because of the mail-in ballot ruling, which was a little bit surprising, gives people more time to vote illegally, let's say. But the SAVE Act is even more important, and that's the right. You have to be a citizen of our country. Okay, you have to show you're a citizen of our country, called citizenship. Voter ID by photo voter ID, and no mail-in ballots unless you're in the military, disabled, you're ill, or you're away, or even on a vacation.
And the president even called out specifically certain Republican senators there, Ryan, as you know so well, that he would like to see come out and support this, but it is pretty unlikely that we're going to see that happen, at least anytime soon.
I would venture to say it's impossible, but we'll continue to talk about it, I'm sure. Thank you, Monica. Let's now turn to Laura Jarrett to get some legal analysis in the wake of all of these decisions. Let's have you walk us through these decisions today. Laura, what was the court's reasons for allowing the president to fire Rebecca Slaughter but not fire Lisa Cook?
Yeah, Ryan, the court really does see the Fed as different. They believe that the Fed should be insulated from politics and that Congress has intended for the Fed to be different. Obviously, the Fed sets its own budget and it has the ability to move markets, and the president has every incentive to try to see some short-term changes to the Fed if he can. We've certainly seen this president try to influence the Fed where he can and put his thumb on the scale where he can. And for the Chief Justice and also at least Justice Kavanaugh, they think that the Fed should be treated differently. It doesn't mean that the president can never fire someone at the Fed. They can do it. They just need to have cause, and that cause actually has some teeth to it, unlike the other federal agencies. But in terms of the day-to-day impact that we might see, what those other federal agencies do actually matters. We're talking about a dozen other federal agencies that really do have an enormous impact if you think about the things that affect everyday Americans, right? Like car seats for children, cribs, the things that like consumers actually see and care about. Those multi-member federal agencies actually do have an enormous amount of power, and they can all now be fired at will.
Okay, let's move on and talk about what FCC Commissioner Ana Gomez, who was appointed by President Biden, said about today's decision. She said in a companion decision, the court protected the Federal Reserve from political interference while leaving media regulators exposed. democracy depends on a free press and the preservation of free expression through all communications technologies as much as it depends on a stable economy. And you've alluded to this already, Laura, but I think the point here is that, yes, the court did seem to provide some level of deference to the Federal Reserve, but there are all these other ancillary agencies that have a very direct impact on the implementation of policy. And in the case of the FCC, for instance, that's usually a very bipartisan board that makes these very important decisions about the way communication is conducted in this country. You know, based on today's ruling, how sweeping is the president's authority? I mean, could federal workers just be fired, and could it happen very quickly now?
Sure. And we've already seen the president attempt to do that and to try to certainly intervene in some civil service protections that up until this point people had thought were off limits. But he's pushing all of those boundaries. And the reason, you know, that this has sort of come up is just because the president has tried to do something that other presidents just simply hadn't done before. But the rule that the court has announced today isn't unique to President Trump. It will last for generations after him, which just means you're going to see a political swing, right, Ryan? So the next time a Democrat is occupying the office, it's not as if they're not going to take advantage of this rule. It just so happens that President Trump was the one who first pushed the envelope.
Right, right. And there was some sense that these federal agencies at least have had a degree of consistency between administration to administration. We may see that change in the near future. All right, Laura, Jarrett, thank you for your excellent analysis as always. Let's bring in our Supreme Court reporter, Lawrence Lawrence Hurley. I like you just the way you are, Lawrence, and take a look at the breakdown of today's decisions, because I do think this is interesting, because we are starting to see some swing voters emerge, it seems like, on the court. And the Trump v. Slaughter opinion, it was 6-3 along the ideological lines that we're accustomed to, with Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh joining the three liberal justices in joining Lisa Cook's firing. But Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett also ruled against the RNC when it comes to mail-in ballots. Are any surprises here for you about how these decisions were reached?
I would say going into today, based on the oral arguments, we had a pretty good sense of how the FTC case was going to come out and how the Federal Reserve case was going to come out. The mail-in ballots one, that was one where we weren't really sure. And I think that the key issue in that case was that there's a lot of practical problems with if they had ruled in favor of the RNC about military ballots and things like that that would be affected by this. And Justice Barrett mentions that in her opinion. And I think, you know, there's certain cases where some justices are concerned by the practical implications, some cases where they're not, some cases where they're in lockstep ideologically, some cases they're not, and we've seen that play out today.
Yeah, okay. All right, Lawrence, thank you for that. We appreciate it. Let's now go to Sahil, who is on Capitol Hill. You know, Sahil, it's no secret that Congress was really already at odds with the White House over the Save America Act. Will today's decision affirming mail-in ballots received after Election Day move the needle one way or another? Could some of these wayward Republicans in the Senate now decide maybe I should get involved and pass the Save America Act?
Short answer, Ryan, is no. I think it's extremely unlikely it moves the needle at all, for the simple reason that the logjam on the Save America Act is in the Senate, where Democrats have the power with the filibuster to block it, and Republicans don't have the votes to get around the filibuster or to nuke the filibuster. What it's likely to do is intensify this conflict within the GOP between Trump on the one hand, who's already pressuring Republicans, saying this is now more important than ever to pass the Save America Act, that he will accept no excuses for it, including to nuke the filibuster, which he has demanded, and a whole host of Republican senators who, as you know, are dead set against that proposition. And I think the more important dynamic is the fact that Trump, by going after several sitting Republicans, has created a bunch of free agents who have no incentive to kowtow to his political wishes. So that is extremely unlikely to change. And the simple fact is you have Democrats celebrating this decision, including the minority leader, Chuck Schumer, saying the Supreme Court just upheld a bedrock American principle, Schumer says, that if you cast your ballot on time, your vote will count, end quote.
But what's interesting about this, Sahil, and it was certainly clear in the Watson versus RNC decision, but it also applied to some of the other decisions today, is that the court made it pretty clear that this really wasn't up to them, that if Congress wanted to change the law, they could change it. And that particularly applies to when ballots are counted. We've already talked about the Save America Act broadly and how Republicans in the Senate, at least a small gaggle of them, don't feel comfortable doing that. But could there be an appetite now to address the mail-in ballot issue all by itself?
So that's a crucial distinction you just made there, Ryan, because the Supreme Court is not saying it's unconstitutional to count the mail-in ballots. They're just saying that federal law as written does not require states to toss out those mail-in ballots. So in theory, yes, Congress can change the law. Are they going to do it? Again, it's extremely unlikely because you need a bipartisan deal to get something through the Senate. And Democrats want to move it in an entirely different direction by loosening certain laws around voting, making it easier to vote, early voting, things like that. Now, you could imagine in an alternate universe that there is some sort of theoretical middle ground, at least with public opinion. If President Trump tried to cut a grand bargain, there are Republican ideas that are popular, including requiring some kind of voter ID to vote. That is very popular. And some Democratic ideas are popular as well. If they were to get things like making Election Day a federal holiday, guaranteeing a couple of weeks of early voting, they might be willing to play ball. But that is not the environment we live in. That is not the mindset of the president, so I don't see it happening.
Okay, Sahil, thank you for that. Let's bring in our election law expert, Nate Persily, to get his take on all of this. So, Nate, first off, just your reaction to today's Watson versus NRC decision. Were you surprised?
I wasn't surprised. I think this was the outcome that most people expected. And if this case had been brought, say, 20 years earlier, I don't think it would have been even a close case. As it stands, it reflects the division on the court, where it's a 5-4 decision, upholding a practice that has happened for many decades, which is that in some states, when mail ballots are received after Election Day, they are still counted.
So, will this have any impact at all then on November's election results?
It won't, because it preserves the status quo. Had it gone the other way, then you would have had several states that would have had to change their rules in order to deal with the fact that they couldn't have additional days in order to count. And so in a state like mine, California, where roughly 400,000 votes that were received after Election Day ended up being counted, it would have required additional resources and maybe changing the rules as to how we administer elections.
Let's stay in California because that seems to be ground zero for President Trump's arguments about the problems with mail-in balloting. He specifically points to the fact that it takes so long to count all these mail-in ballots in California. We saw that play out in the Los Angeles mayor's race, where it appeared that Spencer Pratt was in a position to make it to the runoff, but then after a week or two, he was no longer in that position anymore. He continues to hint that this means that the system is rigged. Is there any evidence here? Can we take anything from this challenge in terms of how Republicans are responding to this, that it could impact elections down the road?
Well, I think there's a good argument to be made that we should have a uniform rule as to when votes can be counted for a federal election. And so I am dismayed, actually, by California's slow pace in counting ballots, especially in a system right now where there's so much polarization and concern about election administration. I think we need to do a lot better in California in counting the votes more quickly. However, this is left up to the states, and there's nothing in federal law that would prevent a state from accepting ballots that are received after the deadline, whether it's in Mississippi or whether it's in California. I just think that we need to be aware that people's perceptions of the legitimacy of the election are in some ways affected by how long it takes to count these votes.
And so part of what Justice Alito said in his dissent, he said, quote, "When someone votes by mail, it is harder for officials to verify the identity of the person requesting and completing the ballot. Mail voting also represents a greater opportunity for voter manipulation, a more vulnerable chain of ballot custody, and a diminished ability to detect improprieties in real time. Today's decision compounds these vulnerabilities." First of all, is there any evidence of that? But secondly, do you worry that comments and rhetoric like this just in general undermine Americans' faith in elections?
I am worried about the rhetoric on this. I do worry that whether it comes from the Supreme Court or whether it comes from the president, that casting doubt on the legitimacy of a system, by the way, which has existed since the Civil War, right? We've had soldiers that have been voting absentee for over 150 years now. And so mail voting has been part of the election administration system for some time. And Republican and Democratic states, right, have administered it fairly without massive fraud, as is suggested. And that's true of places places like Utah, which basically has almost all mail voting. It's true of places like Washington, Oregon, Colorado, which have almost uniform mail voting, and then places like California and Arizona, where the overwhelming majority vote by mail. That we've had a sort of tried and true system for counting mail ballots. The problem right now is that there's so much doubt being thrown at the system by elites, and it doesn't help when a Supreme Court justice does that as well.
And it's worth pointing out that President Trump and Republicans won big in 2024, and there were many millions of mail-in ballots that were cast during that window of time. Nate Persily, thank you so much for your expertise. We appreciate it.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.